Good morning, and welcome to chapter 4 in this series of videos about the 1970s and cultural and social history. And I ended last time talking about the Open University, and so this being part of a tendency, a huge tendency to a wider, a higher level of education, which probably had more effects than we imagine. This is also the moment in April, a little later in April 1971, when unemployment figures reached 815,000. Now, I think you can imagine that if in Britain today it was announced that unemployment was 815,000, everybody would be praising the success of the British economy. But this was the highest figure since the war, since 1940, in fact, since before the war, so since 1939. So you're talking about the highest figure for 30 years. And I think I've already mentioned this. I think the return of mass employment was an enormous social, psychological phenomenon. People really believed that unemployment had disappeared forever. And although unemployment in the 1970s was not like unemployment in the 1930s, in the sense that your children probably didn't go hungry, nevertheless, it was an enormous waste of human resources, and also an enormous psychological weight on people who'd been brought up to believe that working was the most important thing. It's also a year, 1971, when the activities of the Welsh Language Association and other groups with perhaps more radical methods were active. So this was the history of Welsh nationalism. Now, Welsh nationalism is rather different from Scottish nationalism in that it hasn't generally been massively in favour of Welsh independence. And for a long time, it was much more concerned with defending the Welsh language and extending the Welsh language, because the Welsh language, under the pressure of English and sometimes under repressive policies, had been gradually falling in number. And in this particular case, you can see a very simple direct action which was carried out by the Welsh Language Association, which was, as you can see on the right, taking road signs where in Wales only the English name of the town was mentioned and not the Welsh name, and covering them up with the slogan Cymraeg, Welsh. And in April 1971, there was a trial concerning this. Now, this is one of the things which has changed very much since, because the Welsh language has gained considerable rights to a presence in public, from a series of laws. And also, of course, since 1997, there's a Welsh Assembly with quite wide powers in certain areas of public life. And certainly today, if I wanted a job in a university in Wales, they would expect me to at least be learning Welsh. I might not have to speak it fluently. The 1993, the 1967 Welsh Language Act had given the people who wished to do so the right to use Welsh and not English in a court of law. In 1993, another Welsh Language Act would go much further and give practically equal status to English and Welsh in Wales. So notice that this is a tendency which continued through the years of through the years of Conservative government. So it didn't seem to be too much braked by the fact that certainly Margaret Thatcher and her team were thoroughly opposed to any form of autonomy for Wales or indeed for Scotland. The popular music side of the 1970s continued to develop, and in June 71, the Reading Festival was held, and Reading would become one of the avant-garde festivals, and towards the end, Reading would be the first of the music festivals to embrace punk rock, staging such groups as Sham 69 and the Stranglers and the Jam. Notice what it's called here, Reading Festival of folk and progressive music. And this shows a little bit, for the word folk, this shows a little bit the status of folk within British popular culture, which seems to me to be considerably different to the status of folk within French popular culture. Folk was in the 50s and 60s, the folk revival was very much under a left-wing and even Communist Party influence. I don't mean to say that the people who went to folk festivals were communists, but it was considered to be generally more radical and not conservative, whereas in some countries folk music and dance has been more associated with a conservative view of society. So here we have folk and progressive, and progressive in 71 is the idea of progressive rock, which is characterized by longer pieces of music, by a certain influence of classical music, by a concentration on virtuosity in the playing of instruments, by a winding down of the sexual side of rock and roll. The progressive rock players were not supposed to be sexy on stage; they were supposed to be philosophical. Also, progressive rock. Then the rise in philosophical themes and the rise in the use of fairly serious artists for the album covers. So all of these things were going on. That's to say that the choice of what you wanted to listen to and how you wanted to feel about it was tremendously developed, was tremendously widened. And at this time, this is a time when people are, after the 1960s, perhaps even more becoming hippies or punks or metalheads or reggae people. Of course, it wasn't obligatory, but it was not just about, I like to listen to this music, but I am this sort of person. This is a whole development of the space for youth identity. And along the lines of the progressive rock, here you have The Who with their album Who's Next, and you can see something about what I was just saying there. I mean, because if you look at the length of the songs, you have the song is over 6 minutes long and won't get filled again, over 8.5 minutes long. And so this is a reaction against the 3-minute pop song of rock and roll, and indeed which would come back again as a 3-minute pop song of glam rock. On the television too, popular music was being taken a little more seriously. And in 1971, you have the beginning of a late night program, the Old Grey Whistle Test, which is characterized by, indeed, taking popular music seriously as art. It would concentrate on albums, which were considered as a whole rather than a single. New groups who were invited onto the show would not be asked to sing one song, but to sing 5 or 6 and have a serious interview. The budget for the program was extremely restricted, so this was the BBC was accepting that they might produce this kind of thing, but it certainly wasn't a priority. And so this was a big contrast with the other extremely popular popular music program, and which was Top of the Pops, which was much more put forward as a party, songs to dance to or to get sentimental to, and certainly not to be taken seriously, analysed or criticised and so on. Indeed, on Top of the Pops, every song was wonderful. This is what the presenter would say, every song was wonderful. And so whereas the Old Grey Whistle Test, it would be much more, were you influenced by this group or were you influenced by this kind of music, and so on and so forth. Along the same lines, just a couple of months later, Led Zeppelin produces its 4th album, including by far the most famous song, Stairway to Heaven, virtuoso guitar playing, accompanied by philosophical lyrics. Interestingly enough, over the next 40 years, the album sold 37 million copies, making it one of the best-selling albums of all times. So it does seem that this more philosophical, more serious approach to popular music hit a chord. And of course, it's partly linked with the fact that people have more free time, young people have more independence and more space. And so there was more space for para-popular expression or popular expression in popular music. In November 1971 was a technological change, and so this is opening up all the questions every time that I've chosen this series of remarkable or important moments in the 1970s. But why did I choose these, and why are these important? Well, Spaghetti Junction was opened in 1971, and as you can see, it's an enormous 10-route motorway junction opened north of Birmingham. Almost 22 kilometers of motorway had to be elevated in order to allow space underneath for 2 railway lines, 3 canals, and 2 rivers. One of the aims of this construction was to showcase British engineering prowess, and indeed, from an engineering point of view, it's extremely impressive. However, it shows something very remarkable about the 1970s as compared to today, and that is that today, popular opinion would tend to see motorways as unfortunate necessities rather than proof of great progress for society. And I think the most fascinating thing about Spaghetti Junction is that it was opened by a minister. Perhaps not so surprising. It was opened by the Minister for the Environment. And I'm pretty sure that today a British Minister of the Environment would be pretty busy opening a new tree planting program and would not be opening one of the biggest motorway junctions in the world. Oh, not tactile, don't touch. Just a little a publication here. So we're on publications, and that this is actually a publication which was translated into English, and it was released in Britain in 1971. The Little Red School Book, and it included. So there's a slight reference, which I'm not sure if it's ironic or not, to Mao's Little Red Book, which was a collection of aphorisms and political content written by Mao Zedong, the leader of the national revolution in the late 40s in China, and who became a representative for a section of the left in Britain and in Europe for a kind of communism which was not Stalinism. But the Little Red School Book was not really Maoist in particularly, and it was full of advice for school children about how to organize against teachers and headmasters when necessary. It was also full of sex advice, which at the time, it has to be said that sex education in schools was extremely limited. Certainly in the school I went to, there was absolutely zero sex education of any sort at all, so that solved that problem. In any case, this book was successfully attacked in court under the Obscene Publications Act, and it was banned until a second censored edition was brought out. It was written by 2 Danish school teachers and it aimed at encouraging young people not to accept society's norms as given. And it was indeed the frank discussion of sex in this book which made it controversial. And I think my impression is that today, if you wanted to bring out similar content, it wouldn't be necessary to call it red, because there would be nothing particularly radical about it. So we're getting to the end of 1971. This is the moment when Ken Loach released his prize-winning film Family Life, which I have to say is rather depressing. And the Christmas #1 record in the UK singles chart was a mock Western song by Benny Hill, by the well-known but already old-fashioned humorist Benny Hill. Now, let us have a look at just a couple of items from 1971, which are not connected to a particular date. In 1971, 53% of women between 16 and 64 were in employment, that is to say full-time employment or part-time employment. 53% of women between 16 and 64. So you can see that there's a lot of women working, but there's also still a lot of women not working and bringing up children. And the equivalent number for men is 92%. So you can see there's still absolutely huge difference there. This will advance, but rather slowly, because in 2014, the figure for women would be 67%. And I'm pretty sure that in Britain today, it's still lower than it is in France. And we'll come back to this a little later. 1970s board game produced in 1971, Oil Strike, How to Find Oil in the North Sea. And of course, children's games always reflect the culture to quite a large extent. And here, what the publishers are thinking that they can sell to parents for their children is the idea that discovering oil is exciting and is progressive and is the future. And I'm sure you can imagine that today you'd have more chance of selling a board game about Greenpeace stopping drilling for oil or something along those lines. It's also the year where we have the first Mr. Man book published, Mr. Tickle. Very short, rather ironic books for children, which adults also love. Now, the whole thing about children's publishing is huge. Indeed, you know, within the publishing industry, the children's book sector has always been the one of the most flourishing. What does it show about cultural history? Well, I'm not quite sure, but it's worth looking at. This is also from a point of view of intellectual work. This was the year of the publication of Religion and the Decline of Magic, extremely impressive work by Keith Thomas, who looked at the question. It's about the 16th and 17th century, and he looked at what people said in court, in tribunal proceedings, because that's the place where ordinary people's opinions and stories are written down, because they couldn't read and write, but when they are giving evidence in court, then what they said was written down. And he noted that over 200 years only, the number of people talking about magic spells and superstitions and witches and so on went down tremendously. And he had a look at that and tried to understand how it was that religious ideas were rising and magical ideas were collapsing, really. Popular book in 1971, Ivan Illich, Deschooling a Society, was of great influence. This is a Pelican book, so it's quite a relatively popular book. And this is I suppose, vaguely anarchist look at society, which says that, you know, the problem is that, you know, the whole of society is too institutional, that schoolwork is too samey, is too automatic, is too much like a production line, and proposing ways of making society much less vertical. So if we're moving on to 1972, one of the big changes in 1972 is the merging of two kinds of exams. Now, exams, it sounds very technical, but since 1945, perhaps 48, the law was passed in 44, but it took a while to establish. The whole population of Britain took an exam at the age of 11. And this exam decided if they would go to a grammar school, where they would learn more intellectual subjects and end up with a GCE, a General Certificate of Education, or if they would go, like 2/3 or maybe 3/4 of the population, to an ordinary school called a secondary modern school, where they would study far fewer intellectual subjects and far more practical subjects, metalwork, woodwork, for the girls, domestic science, fundamentally cooking and household management. And so this is the traditional idea that was by 11 years old, you know who is intelligent and who is not intelligent in inverted commas, and therefore it's perfectly reasonable to divide children up and to get them to have them educated separately. And this is an idea which in the 60s comes into conflict with two things. First of all, the desire for working class people for betterment, and secondly, the need in industry to have far more educated people and far more young people go to university. And therefore, from the middle of the 60s until the end of the 70s, very slowly, the grammar schools and the secondary modern schools were merged, and it became the, as you say in French, the collège unique, that is to say, the comprehensive school. Now, of course, from a cultural point of view, and this is a huge difference, because this meant that instead of teenagers being separated out, a quarter of intellectual teenagers over there and 3/4 of non-intellectual teenagers over there, which is a huge piece of social engineering, then little by little, everybody was going to the same school and mixing ideas and cultures. And as you can imagine, since middle class children would very often get extra help because their parents would hire somebody to train them, or simply the teachers would take them more seriously. The grammar schools were very middle class places. In any case, in 1972, this trend had a practical effect in that the two different kinds of examination were merged together. And they're tremendously important because this meant that whatever school you went to, you could try to go to university. Now, even today, there are fewer young people in Britain in university than there are in France, but the percentage of young people go to university has risen tremendously since the 1970s, absolutely tremendously, doubled and tripled and quadrupled and more. Now, in 1972, to give you an idea, 43% of young people left school with no qualifications at all, no aucun diplôme, I should say in French. I occasionally get mixed up with this because I've been living in France for such a long time. I tend to use the word diplomas, which is absolutely not correct. It's qualifications is the word you're looking for. In 2016, this was down to 1%. Okay, let me tell you that, give you that again. In 1972, 43% of young people left school with no qualifications of any sort. And in 2016, this was down to 1%. Now, this shows both the transformation of the economy and education, but also of attitudes towards education and qualifications. Many things which used to be learned in the workplace are now in the 21st century learned partly in the workplace, but much more in schools. And so the whole series of qualifications made particularly for certain trades. A few more figures about comfort at home. By 1972, 73% of households had fridges. But the 1970s was the decade when fridges became generalized, and indeed by 1980 we will be up to 92%. And final figure before I get onto the particular dates: in 1972 there were 11.3 million trade union members in Britain. So this was obviously very high, and 11.3 million. And trade union, although we don't imagine trade unions as having a huge effect on culture in general, they certainly had a huge effect on the way that people looked at the world. There were the 1970s, like the 1960s, are fairly well known for a series of radical movements. In the late 60s, the campaign against the Vietnam War crystallized many young people's rejection of imperialism and of the world system, especially, of course, in the United States. But also in Britain, and although in Britain we didn't have a 1968 like was the case in France, nevertheless there was quite a lot of radical movement around the Vietnam Solidarity Committee and around the rise of the Trotskyist left, that instead of being just a couple of hundred became tens of thousands, and had a certain influence. In this case, we have another radical movement, which is the campaign for nuclear disarmament against the idea that Britain needed nuclear weapons. And here you have the 1972 march from London to Aldermaston. Aldermaston was a place where they experimented on nuclear weapons. And just underneath this, you have then the peace festival that went with it. So the campaign for nuclear disarmament, like later movements, put together the idea of popular music and radical politics. And so here we had the Peace Festival organized by the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and people went both for political reasons and also for the music. And here you have John Peel, the great disc jockey, presenting Hawkwind, this is progressive rock, and also presenting a couple of radical poets from the 70s, and this was 60s and 70s, and this was something very notable within literature in Britain, that there was a series of poets who became popular and went around the country reading their poems, either in pubs or at festivals, and this spoken word culture lasted for quite a long time. You can still find it today in Britain, but it was particularly vibrant in the 70s. Adrian Mitchell, in particular, is a very fine radical poet. I remember he was once asked by some conservative newspaper to write a special poem because it was the anniversary of the Prince of Wales investiture. So they were expecting, of course, to write a noble and admiring poem about the Prince of Wales, and Adrian Mitchell simply wrote poem written on the occasion of the anniversary of the Prince of Wales's investiture, and it simply says, "Royalty is a neurosis. Get well soon." So that had a certain energy to it. The changes in the police force. This is cultural history too, but are we going to get stuck with the idea that cultural history is so wide? Robert Mark became the new head of the Metropolitan Police in April 1972, and he's famous because he had a series of top policemen arrested because they were corrupt. And this was a time of the 50s and 60s in particular, where a certain amount of illegal activity, in particular in the big cities, for example, selling pornography, was carried out under the kindly eye of local police who just taxed it and received so much money every week. This was quite institutional and everybody knew it. And Robert Mark was brought in to clean things up. And he famously said, "A good police force is one which arrests more crooks than it employs crooks," being criminals. Yeah, so quite an interesting idea, but also I think representative of the fact that the state and the elite needed a police force which was more reliable and more professional. It also no doubt reflects the huge general trend within society that more and more things were professionalized. For example, where psychological advice had generally been given by your uncle or your grandfather or your grandmother, the rise of the psychologist, initially only for the elites, but later becoming something accepted among the working class, is something that happens over the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The feminist movement I already mentioned, with their huge women's liberation conference in 1980, although in fact I remember I insisted on calling it the women's liberation movement and not the feminist movement, because the word feminist was not consensual. And one of its, the women's liberation movement in the 70s was hugely varied. There were so many different things going on. But one important element was the publication of a regular journal, a regular magazine. And I already explained, if you want a radical movement, you need a publication. Otherwise, it's not real. And Spare Rib was the first mass market publication of the women's liberation movement. And you can see that they followed then the established women's magazine in the publication values, in the quality of the photos and the innovative typography and so on. Previous to this, if you had read a women's liberation magazine, it was probably gestetnet and stapled together in somebody's back room and put in an envelope and sent out to all the subscribers. Spare Rib succeeded in getting into the high street newspaper sellers, and so was something very, very particular. And it continued for, it didn't last forever, but it continued for easily 15 years, probably more, probably 20 years or more. And so also, I'm trying to think how expensive that is, 17.5 pence. I think it's not tremendously cheap, but it did have a certain popular side to it. Although, of course, when you looked inside, you did get the feeling that most of the writers were middle class or even intellectuals. It could be quite heavy to read, but it also spawned a whole series of reading groups, women's reading groups around the country, where women would get together and read the articles and discuss them in the aim of consciousness raising, because one of the characteristics of the women's liberation movement, just like the black movement in South Africa, was the idea that the people pushed down by oppression need to work on how they see themselves and how they see other people from the same group. This is the idea of consciousness raising. Final reform for women, October 1972. 3 Cambridge colleges finally admit women in 1972, which is amusing. Not really, but it's amusing if you think that the university had often wanted to put forward the idea that they were at the forefront of progress. And I'm going to stop here, but I just wanted to mention a television series, the first episode of Emmerdale Farm in 1972, then it continues until today, is the story of life in a village. And it's representative of the soap operas, which have an important place in British popular culture. People, and our soap operas are defined by the fact that they have several storylines, and in the British soap opera they're about ordinary people who are just like us. That's the idea, yeah. And their following is extremely loyal. They continue for many years. Coronation Street has produced new episodes every week since 1960, and Emmerdale Farm since 1972, and EastEnders since 1985. So tremendously long living. You have actors who spend their entire career in one television program. And although they are often mocked by some intellectuals, I think there's something very interesting about them as a leisure activity of identification. And certainly they have put forward gradually, as the years went by, a whole series of social questions, particularly effective. So the first black family in the soap operas, the first trans character in the soap operas, the first gay man on EastEnders, and so on, are truly cultural events because they are watched by 10 million people, and they are not like the careful, well thought out documentary on BBC Two at 11 o'clock at night, watched just by a small minority of the population. So I'm getting through the decade fairly slowly, but I will try to accelerate over the next couple of weeks. And that's all for today. That was chapter 4. Thank you for listening.